Documented patrol logs. Authentic visual evidence. Absolute truth. This is Bodycam incident reports.
Morning, sir.
Just stay right there. Keep your hands where I can see them.
They are visible. I'm just out for a run.
Yeah, we got a call about someone looking into cars around here. You match the description.
I live 4 blocks from here.
Yeah.
I run this route every weekend.
You have ID on you?
No, I don't run with a wallet. Is this a consensual encounter or am I being detained?
At 5:30 a.m. on a Saturday, the streets of Whisper Creek were mostly empty. The planned community, characterized by winding roads and large single-family homes, was quiet. Xavier Grant was 3 miles into a 6-mile run. Before we dive into exactly how this morning jog turned into a federal civil rights lawsuit, drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see where this community is tuning in from. Grant was 54 years old. For the past 14 years, he had served as a judge for the United States District Court. His docket regularly included complex civil litigation, constitutional rights cases, and law enforcement accountability hearings. He was thorough, demanding, and bound by procedural rules. He had lived in Whisper Creek for 8 years. He owned his home. That morning, he was dressed in a gray Georgetown University hoodie, black running shorts, and athletic shoes. He carried a single house key tied to his shoelace. He did not carry a wallet, a phone, or physical identification. He was doing exactly what he did every weekend, running through his own neighborhood. Officer Ryan Miller was 26 years old, with 3 years of experience at the local department. At 5:15 a.m., dispatch broadcasted a suspicious person call. A resident had reported a black male wearing dark clothing, walking near the residential driveways. The caller did not report property damage. They did not report an attempted burglary. They simply reported a presence they deemed suspicious. Miller was patrolling the northern sector of the neighborhood when he saw Grant jogging down Elmwood Avenue. Miller did not observe Grant looking into vehicles. He did not observe him stepping onto private property. He simply saw a black man in a hoodie who matched the broad description provided by dispatch. Miller accelerated his patrol cruiser, pulled alongside the sidewalk, and activated his overhead lights. He stepped out of the vehicle and instructed Grant to stop. Grant paused his run and removed his earbuds. "Morning, I need you to hold up right there," Miller said. "Good morning, officer," Grant replied. He kept his hands visible at his sides. "How can I help you?" "What are you doing out here?" Miller asked. "I am exercising, running," Grant answered. "Do you live in this neighborhood?" Miller asked, stepping closer to the sidewalk. "I do. I live on Crestview, about 4 blocks from here. Do you have identification on you?" "I do not. I am running, and I don't carry a wallet in my athletic clothes." Miller had a choice. He could accept the explanation of a resident exercising in his own neighborhood, or he could prolong the stop. He chose to prolong it. "I'm investigating a report of a suspicious person looking into vehicles," Miller said. "The description was a black male in dark clothing. You match that description." Grant recognized the legal framework of the interaction immediately. This was no longer a consensual encounter. It was an investigatory stop under Terry versus Ohio. "Officer, a generalized description of a person's race and clothing does not constitute reasonable, articulable suspicion of a crime," Grant stated, "especially when that person is actively jogging. Exercising on a public sidewalk is not a suspicious act." Miller was not accustomed to citizens citing legal standards during field interviews. "I need to verify who you are to clear you from this call. Give me your name and date of birth." "Under state law, I am not required to identify myself unless I am being lawfully detained for a suspected crime," Grant replied. "Since you have articulated no specific facts connecting me to a crime, this detention is unlawful. Am I free to leave?" "No, you are not free to leave," Miller instructed. "You are being detained until I can verify your identity. Place your hands on the hood of my car." Miller's decision was a procedural error. He was using Grant's refusal to provide identification as the sole basis to escalate the encounter from a stop to an arrest for obstruction. He had no underlying crime, no victim, and no evidence. Grant did not raise his voice. He stood his ground. "Officer, my name is Xavier Grant. I am a sitting federal judge for the United States District Court. I am telling you clearly that this stop lacks reasonable suspicion, and detaining me further violates my Fourth Amendment rights." Miller looked at him. He heard the statement, but he did not believe it. To Miller, this was just a non-compliant subject trying to talk his way out of a detention. He had heard people claim to be lawyers, politicians, and federal agents before. "I've heard that one before," Miller said flatly. He unclipped his handcuffs from his belt. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back. You're being detained for interfering with a police investigation." Grant knew that resisting physically on the street was a dangerous, often fatal mistake. He knew that the parking lot and the sidewalk were not the places to argue the law. The courtroom was. He turned around slowly and placed his hands behind his back. "I am complying under protest," Grant said calmly as the metal cuffs closed around his wrists. "Make sure your camera is recording." Miller secured the handcuffs, patted down Grant's pockets to confirm they were empty, and guided the federal judge toward the back seat of the patrol cruiser. Other residents were beginning to wake up. Lights were turning on in the houses along Elmwood Avenue. Miller placed Grant in the back of the car and shut the door. He walked to the driver's side, got in, and picked up his radio, entirely unaware of the systemic chain reaction he had just initiated. The ride to the station took 11 minutes. Inside the back of Officer Miller's patrol cruiser, the environment was strictly utilitarian. The seats were made of hard molded plastic designed to be easily hosed down. There were no door handles on the inside. A thick plexiglass partition separated the front cab from the rear. For 14 years, Judge Xavier Grant had sat on an elevated wooden bench, listening to defendants and plaintiffs describe the back of a police car. Now, at 54 years old, he was experiencing it firsthand. His shoulders ached from the unnatural angle of the handcuffs. The cold metal cut into his wrists with every bump in the asphalt. Yet, he did not speak. He sat perfectly still, his mind systematically categorizing the sequence of events as if he were already reviewing the case file in his chambers. Miller had committed a textbook violation of the Fourth Amendment. He had initiated an investigatory stop based on a generalized, non-specific description of race and clothing. When Grant had legally declined to provide identification, as was his constitutional right when no reasonable suspicion of a crime existed, Miller had manufactured a secondary offense. He had arrested Grant for interfering with an investigation that had no legal basis to begin with. It was a retaliatory arrest, pure and simple. In the front seat, Officer Miller was completely relaxed. He picked up his radio and casually called in the transport. "Dispatch, Unit 4, en route to the station, 10 to 15 with one mail. Starting mileage 42,108. Miller felt he had handled the situation by the book. In his 3 years on the force, this was standard operating procedure for dealing with subjects who did not comply immediately. You assert authority, you control the scene, and if the subject challenges you, you use an obstruction charge to secure compliance. It was a pattern of policing built on assumptions and ego, rather than constitutional law. He had no idea he was chauffeuring a massive federal civil rights lawsuit directly into his own precinct. At 6:01 a.m., the cruiser pulled into the secured sally port of the station. The heavy steel garage doors rolled down behind them, sealing them inside. Miller opened the rear door and guided Grant out by the arm. Grant stepped out into the harsh, fluorescent lighting of the intake area. He was still wearing his sweat-stained Georgetown hoodie and running shorts. He looked entirely out of place among the uniformed officers beginning their morning shift changes, many of whom cast passing indifferent glances at the black man in handcuffs. Miller escorted him to the booking desk. Behind the high reinforced counter sat Sergeant David Evans. Evans was a 22-year veteran of the department. He managed the intake flow, reviewed arrest reports for probable cause, and signed off on processing. He was meticulous, perpetually tired, and rarely surprised by anything that walked through those doors. "Morning, Miller. What do you have?" Evans asked, barely looking up from his monitor. "Failure to identify an obstruction," Miller replied, handing over a blank intake form. "Responded to a suspicious person call in Whisper Creek. Subject matched the description of a prowler, refused to provide ID, became uncooperative, and tried to walk away from a lawful detention." Evans typed the preliminary information into the system. "Did you find any stolen property? Burglary tools?" "Negative," Miller said. "He claims he was just out for a run, but he didn't have a wallet on him. Wouldn't give me his name on the street." "All right," Evans sighed, finally looking up from his screen. He looked at the tall man standing in handcuffs on the other side of the desk. Evans's eyes tracked over Grant's face. He paused. A slight frown formed on the sergeant's face. Unlike Miller, Sergeant Evans spent a significant portion of his week dealing with the court system. He processed federal holding requests, reviewed warrants, and occasionally attended legal briefings at the downtown courthouse. "Name and date of birth?" Evans asked, his tone shifting imperceptibly from routine to cautious. "Xavier Marcus Grant," Grant replied, his voice calm and resonant in the echoing booking room. "October 14th, 1971. Evans stopped typing. His hands hovered over the keyboard. He looked at the screen, then slowly looked back up at the man in the running clothes. The name was familiar. The face was familiar. "Any aliases?" Evans asked, though his voice had dropped in volume. "No aliases," Grant answered. "However, I suggest you search the Federal Judicial Registry before you proceed any further with this intake. I advised your officer of this on the street, but he declined to investigate the claim." Miller scoffed, leaning casually against the counter. "Yeah, Sarge, he told me he was a federal judge. Figured he was just trying to talk his way out of the cuffs." Evans did not laugh. He didn't even smile. The color began to drain from the veteran sergeant's face. He opened a new tab on his terminal, bypassed the local criminal database, and accessed the public federal directory. He typed in the name. A moment later, an official portrait loaded onto the screen. It showed a man in black judicial robes sitting in front of the flag of the United States District Court. Evans looked at the photo. Then he looked at the man in handcuffs. It was an exact, undeniable match. The silence that fell over the booking area was heavy and suffocating. The ambient noise of police radios and ringing phones seemed to fade into the background. Evans slowly pushed his chair back from the desk. He didn't look at Grant. He looked directly at Officer Miller. "Miller," Evans said, his voice stripped of all its previous casualness. "Tell me exactly what the underlying charge was, before the obstruction. What specific crime did you have probable cause to believe he committed?" Miller looked confused by the sudden change in atmosphere. "Like I said, Sarge, suspicious person call. Black male, dark clothing. He was in the area." "Did you observe him committing a crime?" Evans asked, his voice tightening. "No, but did the caller state they saw him commit a crime?" "No, they just said he looked suspicious." Evans closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He was a veteran cop, and he knew exactly what he was looking at. He was looking at an arrest devoid of probable cause. He was looking at a textbook case of racial profiling, and worst of all, he was looking at an indefensible civil rights violation standing in his own precinct in handcuffs. "Miller," Evans said quietly, "take the cuffs off him, right now." "Sarge, he was uncooperative." "I said take the handcuffs off him," Evans barked, his voice echoing off the concrete walls, causing two passing officers to stop and stare. "Take them off and step into the watch commander's office. Do not say another word." Miller, finally sensing the gravity of the situation, pulled his keys from his belt. His hands were suddenly slightly unsteady. He stepped behind Grant and unlocked the metal cuffs. Grant brought his arms forward, slowly rubbing his wrists where the metal had left deep red indentations. He did not look angry. He simply looked at Evans, acknowledging that the sergeant understood the severe legal reality that his patrol officer had ignored. "Sergeant," Grant said, his tone even informal, "I require the incident number for this arrest. I also expect all body-worn camera footage, dash camera footage, and dispatch audio related to this stop to be preserved immediately. A formal preservation letter from my attorney will be delivered to your legal department by 9 a.m. Evans stood up, his posture rigid. "Yes, Your Honor, it will be preserved immediately. I am going to wake up the captain." At exactly 6:15 a.m., the silence of a Saturday morning was shattered by the ringing of a phone on the nightstand of Captain Robert Hayes. Hayes was a 28-year veteran of the Whisper Creek Police Department, a man who had ascended the ranks not by chasing glory on the streets, but by mastering the complex machinery of municipal administration. He was a pragmatist who spent his days reviewing liability budgets, use of force reports, and navigating the treacherous waters of local politics. When his phone vibrated in the early hours of his only day off, he expected to hear about a major traffic fatality or a high-end commercial burglary. Instead, he heard the strained, uncharacteristically hollow voice of Sergeant David Evans. "Captain, you need to get down here immediately," Evans said, skipping the standard departmental pleasantries. "Officer Miller just brought in a 10 to 15 from the North Sector for failure to identify and obstruction. The subject is the Honorable Xavier Grant, Federal District Court." Evans paused, and the silence on the line felt heavier than any siren. "Captain, I've reviewed the preliminary intake and the dispatch logs. There was no probable cause for the initial detention. None." Hayes didn't ask for a second opinion. He didn't ask if Evans was certain. He simply hung up the phone, grabbed his keys, and drove to the precinct, with the grim realization that his department had just stepped into a legal minefield. By the time Captain Hayes walked through the reinforced glass doors of the precinct at 6:38 a.m., the atmosphere in the building had undergone a fundamental toxic shift. The usual morning energy, the banter among officers during shift change, the complaints about overtime, the hum of routine paperwork, was gone. In its place was a thick, suffocating tension. Officers were speaking in hushed whispers, stealing nervous glances toward the administrative hallway. The precinct no longer felt like a place of authority. It felt like a crime scene where the police were the primary suspects. Judge Xavier Grant was not in a holding cell. He had been escorted into the watch commander's office, a windowless room that smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. He sat in a standard-issue metal chair, still dressed in his sweat-stained Georgetown hoodie and black running shorts. He had politely but firmly declined a glass of water and a cup of coffee. He was simply waiting, his posture perfectly straight, his eyes fixed on a point on the wall with the clinical, detached focus of a man presiding over a high-stakes trial. He did not look like a victim of a bad arrest. He looked like a man who was already drafting the verdict that would dismantle the careers of everyone involved. Down the hall, in a windowless interview room, Officer Ryan Miller sat alone. His duty belt had been unclipped and left on a desk outside, a standard procedural sign of an officer under immediate administrative review. The arrogance that had fueled his actions on the street had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, paralyzing dread. Captain Hayes walked into the watch commander's office and closed the door, sealing the room from the prying eyes of the staff. He took a deep breath, trying to project a sense of professional control he did not feel. "Judge Grant, I am Captain Robert Hayes," he said, keeping his voice low and conciliatory. "I want to personally apologize for this morning's events. There has been a profound misunderstanding, and you are, of course, free to go immediately. I have a car ready to take you home." Grant remained seated, his eyes locked onto Hayes with a piercing intensity. "Captain Hayes," Grant said, his voice quiet but carrying the resonance of a gavel, "let us be precise. A misunderstanding implies mutual confusion or a shared failure to communicate facts. What occurred this morning was not a misunderstanding. It was a unilateral deprivation of my constitutional rights under the color of law. Your officer did not fail to understand me. He failed to understand the Constitution he swore to uphold. Hayes sat down in the chair opposite Grant, feeling the immense weight of the situation. He knew better than to argue semantics with an Article III judge. I understand your frustration, Your Honor. Officer Miller is young. He was responding to a suspicious person call. He made a procedural error in the field, and I assure you, it will be handled internally with the utmost seriousness. A procedural error, Grant repeated, the phrase sounding hollow in his mouth. Captain, a procedural error is failing to sign a form in triplicate. Officer Miller detained me based on a generalized racial profile. When I asserted my right to refuse an unlawful demand for identification, a right clearly established under both state law and Supreme Court precedent, he manufactured an obstruction charge to justify the use of force. That is not an error, Captain. That is a choice. It is a choice born of a department culture that equates my presence in this neighborhood with reasonable suspicion. Hayes shifted in his chair, the silence in the room pressing in on him. He had read enough case law to know that Grant was meticulously stripping away any potential defense. Qualified immunity was designed to protect officers making split-second decisions in dangerous situations. It was never intended to protect an officer who initiates a bad stop in a calm residential area and doubles down on that error out of pure ego. I want the incident report, Grant continued, finally standing up. His presence seemed to fill the small office, making it feel even more cramped. I want Officer Miller's written statement of probable cause completed before he is allowed to view his body camera footage. And I want the contact information for your city's legal department. I will not be leaving through the back door, Captain, and this will most certainly not be handled internally. 10 minutes later, Judge Xavier Grant walked out of the front doors of the precinct into the bright morning light. He didn't accept the ride. He stood on the public sidewalk and ordered an Uber, leaving the department to deal with the radioactive wreckage of Officer Miller's morning shift. By 10 a.m. on that Saturday, the Honorable Xavier Grant was back in his home office on Crestview Drive. He had not raised his voice during the Uber ride home, nor had he vented his frustration on social media. In the world of high-stakes civil rights litigation, Grant knew that the first person to speak often loses, but the first person to document meticulously usually wins. He sat at his mahogany desk, still dressed in the sweat-stained gray hoodie and running shorts he had been arrested in, and pulled out a yellow legal pad. He began to reconstruct the timeline of the morning with the clinical, detached precision of a surgeon performing a post-mortem. 5:18 a.m., unlawful detention initiated. 5:22 a.m., handcuffs applied. 5:33 a.m., transport to the precinct. 6:15 a.m., identification verified by Sergeant Evans. He didn't just write down what happened. He mapped out the specific constitutional precedents that Officer Ryan Miller had shattered. He outlined the Fourth Amendment violations for the initial stop and the false arrest. He noted the 14th Amendment equal protection claims, establishing that the detention was predicated entirely on race-based assumptions rather than articulable criminal behavior. Grant was not going to let this fade into an internal affairs file to be buried by administrative bureaucracy. He was preparing a surgical strike against the city's policing practices, utilizing his 18 years of experience on this federal bench to ensure the accountability was systemic, not just individual. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, the administrative meltdown was accelerating into a full-scale crisis. Captain Robert Hayes had summoned the city attorney, Sarah Jenkins, who had been pulled away from her weekend to handle what was already being termed the Grant situation. They sat in a windowless briefing room, the blue light of a monitor illuminating their faces as they watched Miller's body camera footage in absolute silence. They watched the young officer pull his cruiser in front of the judge. They listened to Grant calmly explain his residence and his right to refuse an unlawful demand for identification. They watched Miller's body language shift from professional to predatory the moment his authority was questioned. When the video reached the moment where the metal handcuffs clicked shut, Jenkins reached over and paused the frame. She took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose, the silence in the room heavy with the weight of an indefensible legal position. "Tell me you have something else, Robert," Jenkins said, her voice stripped of its usual professional warmth. "Tell me there was a string of burglaries in Whisper Creek last night. Tell me the caller gave a specific physical description of a suspect that isn't just a generic reference to race." "We don't," Hayes admitted quietly, staring at the frozen image of a federal judge in custody. "The dispatch was a suspicious person call. No reported crime, no weapon, no trespassing. Miller went in with zero probable cause and tripled down when he was challenged on the law." Jenkins leaned back, her mind already calculating the settlement figures. As the city attorney, her job was to protect the municipality from financial liability, usually by invoking qualified immunity. This doctrine shields government officials from being held personally liable for constitutional violations, provided the right wasn't clearly established. But looking at the footage, Jenkins knew that shield was non-existent. The right to be free from an unreasonable seizure without articulable suspicion was the bedrock of the Fourth Amendment. There was no good faith defense for arresting a man for jogging while black. "He's not just going to sue for money, Robert," Jenkins continued, pointing at the screen. "Look at his face. He's not angry. He's observing. He was building the record for a federal consent decree from the moment you hit the lights. He's going to go after the department's entire training manual and your stop and frisk data for the last 5 years." The pressure intensified on Sunday evening when the narrative escaped the city's control. A neighbor on Elmwood Avenue, the one who had stood on her porch with a smartphone, uploaded her recording of the incident to a local community forum. She didn't know the man in the video was a federal judge. She just captioned it, "Police harassing a neighbor for running in our own street." The internet did the rest. Within hours, local activists recognized Grant. By Monday morning, the video had 3 million views, and local news vans were parked outside the precinct. The headline was inescapable: "Federal judge handcuffed for running in his own neighborhood." The city's PR department was flooded with inquiries, and civil rights organizations pointed to the incident as undeniable proof of systemic profiling. Inside the precinct, Officer Miller was formally suspended pending an internal investigation. His union representative had reviewed the footage and delivered the harsh reality. The union would ensure his due process, but they could not save his career. The video was too clear, the victim too credible, and the violation too obvious. But for Judge Xavier Grant, firing one officer was only the beginning. He wasn't interested in a scapegoat. He was interested in the policy that told Officer Miller his actions were acceptable in the first place. On Monday at 9 a.m., a courier arrived at the precinct and the city attorney's office with a 23-page single-spaced document. It wasn't just a complaint. It was a roadmap for a federal investigation into the San Diego Police Department's patterns and practices. By Wednesday morning, the 23-page civil rights lawsuit was officially filed in federal court. It read like a judicial opinion that had already decided the city's guilt. Judge Xavier Grant systematically dismantled the Whisper Creek Police Department's reliance on racial proxies masquerading as reasonable suspicion. He cited the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, demonstrating that Officer Miller's actions were a direct execution of a biased training culture. When City Attorney Sarah Jenkins reviewed the final filing, alongside the unassailable body camera footage, she called an emergency session with the Chief of Police. Her assessment was brutally concise. The city possessed zero legal defenses. The footage showed a compliant citizen asserting his constitutional rights, while an officer escalated a consensual encounter into an arrest based on bruised ego and implicit bias. They had to settle. But Xavier Grant was not a man who could be quieted with a municipal check. The city initially offered a substantial financial payout, accompanied by a strict non-disclosure agreement. Grant flatly refused the NDA. The transparency of the settlement was non-negotiable. 9 months after the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the city agreed to a $675,000 settlement. However, Grant never deposited a single cent into his personal accounts. Within 24 hours, he transferred the funds to 3 civil rights organizations funding the defense of marginalized citizens. In his sole public statement, Grant wrote, "I do not require the city's money. I require the city to fundamentally alter the machinery that allowed this to happen. This settlement is not restitution for me. It is a down payment on accountability for those who do not possess a federal badge to shield them." For Officer Ryan Miller, the consequences were absolute. The Internal Affairs investigation found that Miller had committed multiple egregious violations. But the investigation went deeper. Forced by the spotlight of the lawsuit, senior auditors pulled Miller's stop and frisk data for his entire 3-year tenure. The pattern they uncovered was statistically damning. Miller had initiated stops involving Black and Hispanic pedestrians at a rate nearly 3 times higher than the department average. 6 weeks after he placed a federal judge in his cruiser, Miller was terminated for cause. His termination letter cited unlawful arrest, racial profiling, and conduct unbecoming an officer. When Miller attempted to appeal, his union representative advised him to withdraw the petition. The video was too clear. Miller was stripped of his badge, and his decertification guaranteed he would never work in law enforcement again. But terminating one problematic patrolman was merely treating a symptom. The true legacy of Judge Grant's arrest was the systemic overhaul of the entire agency. Triggered by the undeniable evidence in Grant's lawsuit, the Department of Justice opened a formal investigation into the police department's practices. The resulting federal report mandated sweeping structural reforms. The department was forced into a consent decree. They were required to implement comprehensive implicit bias training, establish a civilian oversight board with subpoena power, and install an early warning data system to flag officers displaying disproportionate racial disparities in their stops. One 2-hour detention in a quiet suburban neighborhood had completely rewritten the operational rulebook for an entire metropolitan police force. Judge Grant returned to his bench, presiding over cases with the same terrifyingly calm demeanor, though colleagues noted a renewed focus during hearings involving qualified immunity. The body camera footage of that morning still exists online. It has been incorporated into the curriculum of police academies across the state, serving as a permanent case study in the catastrophic consequences of biased policing and the misapplication of the Terry Stop doctrine. It stands as a testament to what accountability looks like when the system is forced to reckon with its own failures. But this story leaves us with a chilling, inescapable question. Xavier Grant survived this encounter and forced systemic change because he possessed a flawless understanding of constitutional law, the unshakable confidence of his high office, and the immense resources to fight a protracted legal battle. He had every possible advantage a citizen could have. But what happens to the teenager walking home from work who doesn't know the intricacies of the Fourth Amendment? What happens to the essential worker who cannot afford an attorney to challenge an unlawful arrest? I want to know what you think. Does a $675,000 settlement and a fired officer represent true justice, or is it just the bare minimum? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's get a real discussion going about qualified immunity and accountability. If this story changed the way you view police interactions, hit that subscribe button. We will keep bringing you the stories that demand to be heard. Stay safe, know your rights, and I will see you in the next video.
Our review is now complete. For more unedited field recordings, remember to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching Bodycam Incident Reports.